Welcome to another episode of Retrovaniacs, the only podcast about retro games that you'll find on the Retrovaniacs feed. I'm one of your hosts, Jeremy Parmentier, and here are your other hosts, Jeremy Gregory.
Hello.
And Billy Holiday.
Hello there.
And this week's episode will be about the Sega Genesis classic ToeJam and Earl. But as always, before we get started with the game, just a little bit of an update on what we're all playing individually. I'll start this week because I'm already talking. I've been playing Persona 4. I'm at the very end of Persona 4 for the Vita, and I don't know if you guys have finished Persona 4, but there's a certain point where you think the game ends based on entirely a set of conversations you have in-game. Like, it's one scene, and depending on the answers you pick, and it doesn't seem extremely clear which ones are right, only one will take you to the rest of the game, and the other options out of these 10 different menu options during your conversation will just end the game kind of immediately, and you can tell it's not really the end, but you can't really tell why it's not the end. Like, I couldn't figure out easily what the thing was I was supposed to do to continue the game, so I had to look it up. And I felt kind of bad that I had to look it up, and I couldn't figure it out on my own. But I also didn't want to watch the end sequence of this game that you can't really skip, 45 times while I switched different options on this conversation. If I even really assumed it was a conversation that was the problem, because nothing really flagged it, but it was the only thing that kind of had, opposite choices that I could take. Has anyone played a game that has something similar to that, where it doesn't make any sense why the game doesn't continue?
I have played them before, and I can't quite remember exactly what game it was. But I'm never a fan of that, as far as like when it just gives you this random option at the end of the game, and you're not quite sure which one you should really select. I actually Grand Theft Auto 5 kind of did that at the end of the game, and I chose an answer that did not actually continue the game the way I wanted it to. And I found out after the fact that I needed to pick this other thing, which would actually take you on to the real end game. So that's so bullshit. I can't stand when games do that.
Yeah, I've had it's actually my example was going to be Grand Theft Auto 5. You're presented kind of three options at the end, and you assume how one of them is going to go, and it's actually the good one that you want to pick, but it's not presented as that. You think there's going to be dire consequences with that one, and unfortunately with that game, if you don't have a previous save, you're kind of stuck in a massive game like that. You don't want to pick up and play all the way through again to see the other endings or whatnot. I'm not a fan of that mechanic. I'm not even really sure what they're aiming for, kind of with the ambiguous ending or a bad ending. I'm not a fan of bad endings in games, especially when the only way to get the good one is to start completely over. I think it's a very frustrating thing.
I don't mind it when it's a shorter game, like Maniac Mansion. You can have a million different endings because you can really play through that game in an hour and a half once you know what you're doing. Or one of the more recent ones that had because the weird thing with this break is it wasn't at the very end where the choice happened. Like, Mass Effect 3, the choice you have to make as far as the ending is at the very end of the game. So while it certainly is a good and a bad ending, and I guess arguably good, but either way, a good or a bad ending, but it doesn't change what you'll do, what you'll actually get to see other than the end itself. This happens kind of like at the 80% mark, and then there's still a huge chunk of game to go because it's a role-playing game. I've put on probably 20 hours since that choice of extra things, where a game again, like Maniac Mansion you can blow through, or the one that has a midpoint that I was thinking of is some of the Castlevanias where you have to find an item to go to an upside-down castle or an inverse world or something, and it ends if you don't find that item. But again, that's a game you can blow through in 3 or 4 hours to get to that point, and it's all action, so I don't mind doing it over and over again. But this is like, this is killing me that if I didn't know what to do there, and I thought it was something I did wrong earlier and didn't have a save, I'd have to play through 65 hours again to get to where I was. It's just a weird choice.
Was it a question? I mean, after the fact, did the answer that you had to do to make it move on, did that make sense at all? I mean, were you just like, oh, if I knew that, then I could have just picked that?
I mean, it made sense, but it was like I thought I made that choice originally, but it's just in how they worded the decisions that some of them were not, black and white. I mean, clearly some of them are bad. I mean, I don't want to spoil anything, but at the end, if it was like if you were seeing someone trying to rob somebody, and then your options were I'll stop the robbery or I'll look in the other direction. I mean, it's kind of like that where it's very clear cut and dry. Instead, this was like stop the robber, attack the robber, push the robber, and it's like, well, what am I supposed to do? And I picked the one that I thought made sense, and it just didn't end, or it did end, and it didn't continue in the right way. I mean, at least it was very clear that was not really the ending. But it still was long like an ending. I mean, it was probably a good 10 minutes after that choice to see the rest of the game, and you couldn't skip the credits, and it was very, very long. Very, very long to find out that it's not really the end.
Huh.
But
that's great. The only other game I can remember that sort of did that was Symphony of the Night. And I had bought the Japanese version of that game. And most of it is in Japanese. All the items are in Japanese if you get that game imported. And it's just, I made it all the way through, and I beat the last boss in the regular castle. I went a full 2 years before I even realized there was an upside-down castle, because you have to use a very specific item on that last boss before it will actually let you go to the next part of the game.
And that's at least a case where it's a translation issue that you didn't know what to look for. In the English version of that game, they made it pretty clear if you played through most of the game what you were supposed to do to really get to that end. But I can see if you couldn't read the language how you'd be totally lost. This, on the other hand, was entirely in English, and it seemed pretty vague on how to complete it. But I'm still enjoying it. I'm still almost done. I'm sure by the next podcast I'll have finished it. But what a weird choice.
Yeah, I haven't got that far yet. I got right up to the point, I think right before that, the dungeon before that happens, and I haven't touched it. And I keep meaning to go back to it, but I just never do.
Well, what else have you been playing, Jeremy?
I'm still working my way through Arkham Knight. I think I'm around 70% done so far. Really just been doing the side missions. A lot of those in the game. There's just so many of them. But I enjoy doing them because the world itself, I know I've been talking about these giant open worlds just being so tedious. I really like getting around Arkham Knight's world because it's not huge. Like, it's big, but you can go from one end to the other in just a couple of minutes. Like, it doesn't take any time. So I really enjoy just kind of going around doing those side missions and really putting off the main storyline until I get those done. But I imagine I will finish that up next week, so you won't have to hear me talk about Batman Arkham Knight anymore.
And Billy?
I guess I'm probably just going to copy all of Jeremy's answers for these questions. I've also been playing Arkham Knight. Just wrapped up a couple of days ago. Finally got 100% after tracking down the last few Riddler trophies. Arkham Knight, another one that upon finishing it the first time, when you finish the main story, you find out there is more to be had after you complete a certain number of side missions, and then to get the so-called true ending, you have to 100% it. So I played through that, and also not much else. I dedicated a lot of time to our game today. I guess I was just really relieved to finally be reviewing a good Genesis game. Other than that, I've been playing a little bit of Team Fortress 2, which over the last couple of years is pretty much the only first-person shooter I can really stomach playing for any length of time.
Well, I've never been good at Team Fortress 2, so we should probably move on and talk about our game this week, ToeJam and Earl for the Sega Genesis.
what a game it is. I played this one a lot growing up. I had one or two friends, and when they came over, growing up with friends, you have games that you kind of look back and like, that was our game, a game you rented every time a friend was over, or you went ahead and bought. A couple friends, close friends, almost every weekend I was playing ToeJam and Earl, and I can't say enough. I knew I had a lot of nostalgia. I had to kind of look beyond going into this, and I think I did a pretty good job of that. I'll get more in depth into it. It met a lot of my expectations. In some ways it also didn't, and like I said, we'll get more into that as we go along. But one thing definitely I wanted to mention early on, and I kind of looked at it this way when I went into playing in the mindset of reviewing, is it's almost a game you have to look at in two different ways. You have to judge it as a two-player cooperative game, and then you have to kind of look at it as a single-player game, because one of those, it's much more enjoyable than the other.
Oh, it's clearly made for two players. I mean, the first thing you see after you start the game and get to the start screen is it starts at two players. It doesn't say one player, then two player. It's two player, where one player plays ToeJam, who's a little red alien, and one person plays Earl, who's like a big fat alien, but they essentially play the same. Or you can play single player, where you pick which character you want to be. But it's clearly designed to be a two-player cooperative game.
And I never really got into this game as a kid. I never played it. I always saw it at the video store, but every time I looked on the back of the box, it just looked weird. And as someone that only got to rent one game a week, I didn't really want to put my chances on something that looked strange like this game. And not saying I wouldn't have enjoyed it when I was a kid, but I usually stuck more closer to like the stuff that I knew was going to be something that I knew, like a platformer or a racing game. But this game it looked really, really strange to me, and I never gave it a chance. So I was pretty excited to finally see what the fuss is all about.
Well, I think I have a pretty good combination of the backgrounds to both of you. I did play this a lot as a kid with my brother, both of them, but it was when we went to rent a game, it had to be multiplayer, because otherwise three people would just fight over a game over and over and over again. So finding a game that two of us could play was better than that, especially if it was something that wasn't at that time they still had games where one player would play and then the next person would play and then the first person would play. This was a good two-player at the same time cooperative game. And so we did, the first time we played it, we kind of just rented it because it was two players and looked a little bizarre. But then after playing it for a while, that first weekend, we were hooked. We had to find a copy of it. It became a staple of our Genesis collection, to the point where I can't remember what other Genesis games I had necessarily, because ToeJam and Earl was the one that I kept going back to over and over and over again. So I also had to make sure I could kind of ignore that nostalgia when I was doing the playing for this time. And I think playing it single player really does a good job of that, because this game is probably about a tenth as fun by yourself.
I could definitely attest to that.
I don't know what Mr. General Chaos's problem is with this game. But yeah, multiplayer, I don't think at that time you could find a better title, especially and like you said, back then, a two-player game, you kind of took turns. There weren't a lot of cooperative. This may have been the first split-screen game I ever encountered. But yeah, I can see single-player, you lose a lot of the fun factor. There's a lot more frustration. It's generally a bit more difficult. I don't think they let up on you when you go into single player. So not as good of a game in single player. Still, I think one of the better Genesis offerings, even in single player mode.
Well, I guess to get started with the actual game itself, over just saying if it's fun by yourself or fun with someone else, is to explain what the game generally is. So it's a kind of an exploration game more than anything else. The maps are if you choose to play this way, which again the default is randomly generated maps. You go through a series of fairly small randomly generated maps. As you go, I think you're supposed to be going upwards because you use an elevator to go from level to level, and you are trying to find pieces of your spaceship. You find all 10 pieces of your spaceship and put it back together, and you'll get to fly back home to your planet because you're supposedly on Earth, although it looks nothing like anywhere on Earth I've ever been. But you wander through the levels, and there's a lot of kind of weird creatures that are trying to stop you that are, I guess they're supposed to be funny, and they are kind of funny, but they're not. It's not ridiculously funny for the most part. There's, like an old lady with a shopping cart, and then there's a bunch of nerds that run around as like a group of nerds that can run you over, and like a cherub that shoots an arrow at you. It's a lot of weird little cartoony guys that are trying to stop you, but it's definitely not like a bunch of army men.
Yeah, and half the time I was just sitting there just asking, is this for real? Like, there's... At one point, there was a group of ducks or pigeons or something throwing tomatoes at me, and some weird guy that just kept tiptoeing around to try to get me. This game is weird. I don't know how to really describe it other than just saying it's a weird game in just about every single way.
And I mean, I think, and that's something that probably completely splits the audience in half as to whether you like it or not. It's got a lot of quirks to it. Like you said, you went over some of the enemy characters. They range, just they keep going up in, how ridiculous they are. Except for that damn ice cream truck, who is the biggest threat in the entire game. And there's absolutely no warning, except I think maybe just a little bit of a jingle before he comes out. A lot of strange enemy characters, a lot of strange friendly characters also. You've got Santa Claus, you got a hula girl, there's wizards walking around. And another thing in it, there are also presents kind of scattered around. And early on in the game, when you pick up a present, you have a whole present menu you can pull down. There's at least over 20 types, I'd imagine. And, there are question marks there. And you select them. You're kind of rolling the dice every time you do that. They're identified after you use them once. Some of them, it's everything from just random power-up, running shoes to speed you up, rocket skates to make you go even quicker, springs that are good for nothing but throwing you off the level. And there's everything from something that refills your health to a present that actually just kills you right there on the spot. There's a lot of crazy things happening. And I think early on, within the first level or two, you kind of get an idea as to whether or not you're going to get into this game or you're not.
Well, I like the presence aspect of the game. I like that you go around, you pick up random objects. You don't know exactly what they do, except for you start at the beginning with 4 like speed shoes that let you run faster. Those are labeled. And if you pick up more of those presents, all presents that look the same, if they have green wrapping and a yellow bow and they're a long rectangle, they all are the exact same item. So after if you get 2 of the same present, it's like, I'll just use one to see what it is. Because after you use a present once, it vanishes from your inventory. So a lot of the early part of each level is getting as many presents as you can of different types and using them so you can map out every single item. Because a lot of them are extremely useful. Yeah, the jump shoes that you talked about earlier are terrible. But the Icarus wings that let you fly, although they don't last very long, will help you get through a lot of the later levels very quickly. There's a present that just levels you up. Leveling up in this game is not impressive, really. The more you explore, the more things you pop, because you can pop some of the enemies if you get tomato guns and... not tomato guns, tomato slingshots, or just throwing tomatoes at enemies will somehow make them pop, because Earthlings are filled with air, I guess. I don't really know. But you'll level up, and that gives you more health. You can also get extra lives. So... a lot of the presents, it's well worth knowing what they do. But the downside is, like you said, there's a present that immediately kills you. One of the presents just is called food, and it could either be good food that heals you or bad food that does damage to you. So if you're in a lot of trouble, you might think, I'll use some food real quick to get better. And instead you instantly die when you eat moldy cheese or something. So it's worth it to map out what each of the objects does. And I enjoyed that part of it. I mean, it's kind of frustrating at the same time if you don't have them mapped out. And there's one item that might actually be worse than the one that kills you, which is the one that re-randomizes what all the packages are. That when you get that item, that's what I call the game. I'd turn it off. I don't even bother trying to relearn what the packages are. If you're far enough along, you've just guaranteed you're not going to win. So go ahead and turn it off and start again, because you can probably get back to where you were in a couple hours. But yeah, that's the most frustrating thing in any game ever, is the random re-randomizer for the packages. Just awful.
And that's what really just immediately put me off to this game. Any game that gives me a power-up or even a present, like in this game, and it fucking kills you when you use it, or it hurts you. I understand, it's supposed to be about trying this stuff out and knowing what it is, but the fact that it's there, it doesn't have to be there. The developer put that in there for you to use it and to die. And that's not good to me. I don't understand how that's charming or whatever. But as soon as that happened, I was just like, oh, this is what kind of game this is now.
Yeah, and there are ways to kind of counter that to a small extent. When I played, I was always, I don't know if I was less adventurous, I was always a little leery about just opening up the random gifts. There are characters you can collect cash as you go along. Some presents have it, sometimes you find it laying about. And there's a character, he appears, it seems like every few levels, for whatever reason, in a carrot suit. And he will identify things for you for $1 or $2. I can't remember which.
$2.
$2. All right. Very good. And I always tried to hoard my money until I found him to get him to uncover it. I don't know if I was really missing out by not just taking a blind stab at it. But that was the way I played, and so I could avoid a lot of the more negative. Of course, with the food, it's always you're always going to take a chance. I guess kind of like real life. But you could get rid of the one that instantly kills you, which is a total bummer, I think it's called.
I think it's bogus or total bummer. You're right. Total bummer is right.
Either one is a sign of the times, and this game is certainly a sign of the times. Every little bit of it.
Yeah, that's something we didn't really touch on. I was kind of going to start with that, and then I forgot about it. But the game came out in 1991, and the entire visual look and the entire soundtrack of the game is very much early 90s, late 80s, like in living color style, funk music, R&B music, sort of based, and a lot of the characters, the weird characters and the bad guys, all kind of remind me of graffiti in many ways. So it's got that sort of urban feel to it. But you can clearly tell it's by people who don't live that lifestyle. They aren't really into that scene. They aren't, it's just kind of this looks really cool. Like kind of if you played Brutal Legend on the 360, it's got this heavy metal feel to it. But you can tell it's just like, oh, we like how these things look, and we kind of like some of this music. But it's not like it's a game made by guys who play metal for guys who play metal. It's just taking that style and kind of twisting it to make it. That's the interesting mark for this game, and this clearly fits into that. In living color is what I thought of when I played this the whole time. I was like, man, if I was watching in living color on TV now and playing this game, I would be right back in middle school.
Yeah, and that's one of the best things about the game for me is just how early '90s it looks. It looks like it came straight out of like Nickelodeon or something like that. It's just the sound and everything is really great, and It's neat. It's definitely going back in time and seeing a product of the early 90s and what everyone thought was cool in the early 90s, even though it's kind of embarrassing. But still, it's fun to look at.
Speaking of embarrassing, and yeah, looking back on this, early 90s are all over this thing. And one other part, you spoke of embarrassing facts. Before you start the main game, there is also an option to enter a mode where ToeJam and Earl are there, and each direction and every button will either make a sound or like an instrumental type noise. And I guess it's a rudimentary way to kind of put a song together. And my cousin and I that I would play this with would oftentimes do a little freestyle rapping right before we jumped in.
It reminds me a lot of like if you played Parappa the Rapper, where you get to do the freestyle part, where after you've rapped enough with making the song go to where it's supposed to go, then it's like you can freestyle and your character just starts saying random garbage. That's how this whole thing plays when you're doing the freestyle here. It's like there's a beat behind you and then your guy's like Earl, Big Earl, ToeJam. And I was like, what am I doing? And I was sitting here playing this downstairs. I was like, oh, nobody comes down and catches me. This is the most embarrassing thing I've ever done on this computer.
Are you sure about that?
Well, at least that I'm going to talk about on this show.
All right.
I don't know if I'd say this game has aged as well as I wanted it to. I think if I would have sat down here and played with another person, I would have thought it was still just as fun as I did then. Because I also remember then thinking this game goes on forever. But I think it's because it was the kind of game you didn't really want to end. If you're playing with a friend and you actually are taking the time through it, it's just like, oh, this is what we're going to do all night. So if you can play a game for 4 hours and not really get to the end, that's okay sometimes, depending on the kind of game it is. This is that kind of game, but by yourself, man, it gets monotonous fast. The first few levels are kind of small, and they quickly grow to proportions that, if you walk all the way to the corner of the map and you don't find the exit or the piece you're looking for, and you have to go through the other 3/4 of the map, you're really bordering on just deciding to play something else completely.
That was the big thing with me. I didn't mind it so much in the first 7 or 8 stages, but I think around level 10 or so is when the map fills the entire, or just about the entire map grid screen that you can go to. And walking around that thing by yourself and just trying to find the exit or whatever is so tedious, and I got so tired of it. It could take anywhere from like 10 to 20 minutes if you don't go the right way, or you find yourself backtracking all over the place. And I just got tired of it, and it took me everything I could muster to get past. I think I got around level 18 or 19 before I just said, "Fuck it, I can't do this anymore." It just gets so tedious.
And I think that's probably a common complaint amongst anybody that tries this thing alone. I played with a friend my first playthrough, and it like Jeremy P. was saying, it was enjoyable. Sit down and play with a friend, and there was no trouble, putting the time into, putting 2 or 3 hours into finishing up the game. And I remember back as a child playing this, as soon as it was over, you wanted to get back in and you wanted to start again, which was one of the good things about the randomization, was you could kind of just get right back into it again and get a fairly new experience. But when I started playing one player, and the map, you do have a map that you can look up, but this map is not revealed. It's revealed like one square at a time, but it's not revealed until you step onto that square. So there's a lot of just blind exploration. And yeah, it's much easier in 2 players to kind of, divide and conquer. I'll take the bottom half of the map, you go take the top, and there's even presents that will, in 2-player, bring the 2 of you back together. So it's nothing to divide up. One of you finds the elevator, one of you finds the ship piece that you're looking for. You throw the present on, and you're back together, and you move along. In single player, you don't have that luxury. You pick one direction, you keep walking until it runs out, and you just hope you pick the right one. Yeah, it gets fairly tedious, and 2 players, I had no trouble finishing this in a couple of hours. Single player, I got maybe half the pieces. I got around the same part. I got in the mid to late teens level-wise, and, I'd had enough. I just finished it up there. Really, it was becoming more of a chore than anything else.
Well, yeah, that's what I really thought when I was playing this by myself. Is it is a chore, and the kind of in a reverse, I guess probably not the message they meant to send out was when you get to a level and there's a piece on the level. It says, "Hey, here's a tip. There's a piece on this level," but that means that every other level they're saying there's no reason for you to be here, so find the exit as fast as you can. And that's the levels where, I'd go all the way to the upper left corner and there's nothing there. And then I'd have to go all the way to the upper right corner and there's nothing there. And there's not many items that make you go faster. And the warp item that's like a door kind of just takes you to a random area. So a lot of the time, it just felt like I was walking for 5 minutes to get somewhere, trying to avoid guys that are trying to kill you. It got less and less fun because it wasn't that I felt that I was in danger most of the time. I was in danger of just falling asleep, so you have to run as fast as you can to not fall asleep.
And one of the, I think it was smart to go the random stages route, but one thing that, one bad effect that has is it's obvious that this game doesn't have very many different tile sets for the levels. So they all kind of look the same after a certain point. And it's there's really nothing new that you see beyond like maybe level 7 or 8 or something like that. So it's just kind of the same level over and over, just in different setups. And I just got tired of looking at the same thing over and over again.
And one of the level design choices that I still don't like, and at the time is, when I was playing it when I was younger, I thought it was kind of a neat feature, but now it just annoys me, is there's a lot of levels where to connect big islands, there's little pathways that connect these big islands, and sometimes they don't show up until you walk in exactly the right spot, and then they pop into existence. And that's extremely annoying now, especially when you're like just trying to find the elevator to go to the next level because there's no reason for you to be there. You don't want to waste time looking at presents. You just want to get to the next floor. You only need 1 or 2 pieces left for your ship, and you've already been playing this for 3 hours because it's random. All levels have the puzzle pieces or the ship pieces. So, I mean, single player, this is more of a test of how much you really want to see the ending to the game. But 2 players, at no point is extremely hard. So it's kind of just a nice laid back, oh yeah, we have some pizza, we got some beer. Although as a kid, I guess you shouldn't have any beer. But even now, if I had some people over, we each had some beer and just play, ate pizza and drank beer and play this, it would be fun to play through this for 2 hours because it's just goofy enough that it's interesting. But single player,
see that. I could enjoy this as a 2-player game. I think it's just I couldn't get anyone to actually sit down and play it with me the time that we had. But I could see being able to, have a friend sitting there and being like, all right, you take this side of the map, I'm going to go over here. If you need anything, let me know. It could be fun like that. Co-op was one reason why co-op was so fun back then. And I wish I could have played this as a 2-player game because it sounds really interesting. But yeah, definitely as a 1-player game, I could have done without it.
Well, there were some sequels to this game. We talked last week about how there's a Kickstarter for a new sequel that just finished. Kickstarter just finished in March of this year, so this game won't show up for a long time. But there were 2 other sequels. The second game was still on the Genesis, and it was called Panic on Funkotron. It was a totally different style of game. It was a side-scroller. Instead of being the top-down view like this game has the whole time, it was a side-scroller. It still was very similar in that there were presents and hidden things you had to do, but it was a very, very different game from this. But I still wouldn't say it's an action game or a run and gun shooter or anything. It's still kind of an exploration game, but on a flat plane. And I did not try that 2 players at all. I've only played it once, and I only played it for the purpose of this podcast. But it's definitely weird. I don't think I disliked it, but I don't think it's nearly as interesting as this was.
I played it at the time, and I played it again shortly after I played the first one recently. I didn't care much for it then, and I still don't now. I will say it's one of the more unique and one of the better looking and sounding Genesis games over that console's history. But I didn't really care for it. They went for a lot of the same, like you said, a lot of the same exploration, the collecting instead of the pieces this time. The whole story is that, yes, you've landed back on your home planet, but a bunch of humans have hitched a ride. And you're going through, and instead of collecting pieces to your ship, you are tracking down and collecting the humans to send them back. And I just don't think that the whole exploration works in a side scroller. I just didn't care for it altogether. And reading up a little bit on it, the developers, the sequel to ToeJam and Earl was going to be more in line with the first one, kind of that top down type of randomized exploration, but it was pressure from Sega to kind of do something different and take it in this direction. So I don't think the developers' hearts were really in it, and I think that shows. I think it lacks a lot. As good as it looks, as good as it sounds, I think it lacks a lot of the kind of character of the first one.
This is probably going to make Billy get up and leave, but I think Panic on Funkotron is a better game than ToeJam and Earl 1.
Oh, boy.
I think single player, I may not disagree necessarily, because even though I only played it once, I didn't get bored with the second one. I thought it was at least a different kind of game, and it felt more like something that you'd want to play by yourself, although I could still see how it would be fun with 2 players, where this single player really felt, like a trudge after the first 5 levels.
And there was less just complete randomness in the game. It was more of a very straightforward, here's what you need to do. It's very clear on things. And I thought the visuals went a long way in making that game more interesting for a longer period of time for me, because just with how quick I got bored of the first game, the second game looks amazing. It's a really great looking Genesis game, regardless of what you think of the game itself. But I really had more fun running around and playing that game because it seemed more like an actual video game instead of this weird exploration kind of random shit happening all the time. It was just more of a video game to me.
And I can't fault you. I can fault you a lot for the last show. I can't fault you too much for enjoying this one more. I think this was probably a good move on Sega's part to kind of push them in this direction. I think this game has a more broad appeal to it, and I think overall this one is pretty well received. But I really enjoyed something about the kind of randomized exploration from the first one. I just really enjoyed, and I was hoping for, most of the time with sequels, I want something different. I guess this was one time I was wanting more of the same. And, I didn't get that. And I don't know, I just didn't really enjoy it. It's tough. It's lonely being a ToeJam and Earl purist. It's very lonely.
I do agree that the second one, it was different, but it was too different. Like, I always want something a little more in a sequel. For the most part, I don't want to see the exact same game. But I also want it to still kind of resemble the original game, and the second one really didn't. Other than in the feel of the game and the graphic style of the game, it definitely had connections, but it played totally different. So, they made it.
I didn't have that nostalgia for the first game at all. So, maybe back then, if I had played ToeJam and Earl first, and I was really hooked on it and got to like it, I could understand where playing that sequel would be like, what is going on here? This isn't ToeJam and Earl at all. But coming from somebody that has no prior investment in that game series at all, I thought the sequel had more character and more charm than the first one.
Well, it's a risk they have to take. Either you make the same game again, and people complain that it's the exact same game, like the Marios. They changed a little bit, but in general, it's for the Nintendo era at least, it was more or less the same game. Or you go completely different for each game and see what happens, and that's the route they went with this first sequel. The second sequel, on the other hand, was on the Xbox, and I did have this game, the ToeJam and Earl 3. I hear
it's really bad. That's all I've really heard about it ever.
It's a hard thing to say that it's bad. I think the game itself is not bad. It's got the same problem this does, that by yourself it feels like it's a chore. It's a 3D universe, but it still kind of feels like the first game as far as the maps are sort of randomly generated feeling. And I don't know if they necessarily were or not, but at least when they designed the maps, they had to have randomly generated the maps because they don't make any sense otherwise. It's just platforms in the middle of nowhere. I mean, they try to say they're street corners and things, but they end up just being floating pieces in the middle of nowhere that you walk from place to place. You do have the same kind of assortment of creatures that this first game had, and you're still supposed to be walking around using presents like you did in this game. The problem with the third game is that, unlike this game, they had the benefit of being able to add video and sound. And they did. And so if you're going to make a game that's supposed to be based on, early 90s and late 80s funk and R&B, and you can now add in a whole lot of video and a whole lot of sound, instead you have like an all-women choir that's in there for no reason all the time, and there's scenes where Earl and ToeJam talk, and it's borderline offensive, and it's just... That's the game where the whole theme for me kind of just became more embarrassing than it was worth to play the game. Also, my problem with that game is they added boss characters, which we didn't bring this up earlier, but there's no bosses in this game. You find all the pieces to your ship, and then you fly home. So the last boss is you find your ship and you leave. There's no big boss fight. It wouldn't make any sense. Well, it didn't really make sense in the third game either, the way the game played. It made sense for the storyline that no one cares about, but... they didn't need to be there, and so therefore imagine trying to fight a boss where you're using a bunch of randomly assorted items, and you'll see how amazingly frustrating that has to be if you had to have a certain item to jump up and hit the boss in the face. And that's kind of what you have to do in ToeJam and Earl 3. It's not good, and I would not be surprised at all if when the Kickstarter comes out they pretend it never happened.
Earl. Yo. Earl.
Yeah.
Thank you. Now try to keep the lights on upstairs, Earl. You know what I'm saying? No more falling asleep, alright? This is a very important movie, Earl. We got to document this, for the posterity of the universe and all that. You know what I'm saying? Yo, Earl. Wake up, Earl.
But at least it did introduce some new characters. It wasn't just ToeJam and Earl. It was ToeJam and Earl, and I don't remember the third character's name, but it was a female alien with dreadlocks. And I never ever used them.
I remember hearing about it, and I think I remember seeing the reviews in magazines, and it was all just like 2s and 3s, and just getting completely murdered. But after what you said about it, I kind of want to play this game now, because it sounds absolutely terrible with the FMV and the music and the voice acting and stuff like that.
It's not FMV, thankfully. If it was people dressed up like ToeJam and Earl, that would be a keeper. I would never get rid of that game. No, this was little fully digital clips, but of cartoons still. But still, I'll definitely play some after this segment. Just a very short clip of what I'm talking about. But imagine if the entire game, every time you did anything, sang a song like this.
You got to have a soul purpose. Convert the earthlings to the ways of fun and spread the word.
And that's why I can't play that game. I can't recommend it. I think this one is way better. It has the same feel as I think what they were aiming for in 3, but I'd compare it to the difference between the Blues Brothers and the Blues Brothers 2000.
All right, I got you there.
That's more or less the problem with the third one. And that it didn't need to exist. It was basically just a reimagining of the original game, a different story, but same kind of gameplay.
I mean, ToeJam and Earl fans keep saying that they want a new ToeJam and Earl, and whenever they get one, it seems to just keep getting worse and worse. So I don't know if this may be like the Sonic thing where you guys just need to stop asking for one, maybe tell that Kickstarter to go away, make something different. But I just don't get why ToeJam and Earl fans keep coming back and being like, yeah, that would be great. I want to play a new game in that. You probably don't.
And I'm one of them. I have hope for a new game, a new entry in the series. I think just at the time, the early 90s, I think I was just the right age. I was interested in the culture it kind of tried to pass off as at that time. I think there's just it's one of those titles for myself, and apparently for a lot of people, there's this really heavy, not like the level for a Mario or Zelda, but just a really heavy nostalgia there. And it seems like there's not a lot of footage. There's some screenshots, there's some rough demos. The Kickstarter has me slightly concerned. It looks like it's kind of going back very much so to its roots. You've got the top down, just exploring what looks like randomly thrown together chunks of land. But they're going for kind of a comic book, hand-drawn ToeJam and Earl, but they're placing them on what looks like kind of more photorealistic backgrounds and settings. So I'm going to keep an eye on it, but I'm slowly trying to lower my expectations for it, if it even gets released. The Kickstarter passed, but how many times have those gone through and the initial project hasn't?
I think the one thing that would really get me 100% into it was if they just went completely 100% doing the whole bad early 90s style. Like, of course, the first game was intentionally trying to be cool and, extreme and all that kind of shit. But that's not going to fly now unless you just go all the way. And I would really like to see a game like that. I think that would be at least funny to me.
Yeah, it's not going to be able to take itself seriously at all. It's going to have to just be a parody of everything early 90s thrown in.
Well, it's definitely unique. I'll give it that. And I think to get back to the original game, I think it did age well enough that if you have two players around, it's definitely worth trying. And by yourself, the good news is if you play the first 5 levels, you've pretty much experienced the game. So go ahead and play those 5 levels, spend 20 minutes doing it. You'll enjoy those 20 minutes, and then just turn it off and find something else to do.
Yeah, I think it's fun. I've kind of talked shit about this, the whole thing. I say fun, but I mean, it was very unique for the time. And if I would have rented this as a kid, I don't think I would have regretted it. I think I would have probably got bored with it if I kept playing it by myself, but it would have been unique enough that I could have understood why this has stayed sort of a classic with the people that really enjoyed it back then. So it's still fun to play. I mean, it's perfectly playable. There's nothing wrong with it in that department. But it's just once you get past a certain stage, it's probably not very fun anymore.
Yeah, and I recommend the same course of action. If you have 2 people, go ahead, give it a shot. Play it through to the end. You'll have a good time, with a good friend. It'll only take you a couple of hours, probably at best, 2 or 3. Single player, like Jeremy P. said, play 20 minutes, 30 minutes. If it's eating away at you to see the ending, you're better off just looking it up online. Do not try single player wise to put yourself through the entire game. And if you have to, there is going to be tad bit of boredom there, and there's going to be a little bit of frustration.
I will say, if you're going to try it yourself, as one last note, that if you pick the fixed levels option, it apparently is much shorter because it is set. I guess they decided that randomly deciding what levels have these ship pieces would drive everyone insane. So I think it only goes up to level 29, and the ship pieces are kind of evenly spaced out, and the levels are designed in a specific way where there were apparently guides that Sega put out that said, hey, in level 4, the exit's in the top left corner. So they must have realized these same complaints and then built a game that would be much faster. If you're going to play by yourself, I think you can probably beat the single-player fixed in a couple hours. So maybe that's the route to try. But I liked the randomness of everything as well. So I couldn't make myself do it, but if I picked this up today and had never played it before, perhaps that would have been a much more preferred style.
Yeah, and that's really smart on their part. I got really frustrated, I think, around level 14 or so, where I would go 3 stages, and then I would get a stage where it would tell you that you have your spaceship part, and then literally the next stage, it would have a spaceship part again. And then I would go 4 or 5 stages and nothing. So I could understand why they would want to even that out a little bit, because with how random it is, it's good and bad, and I think it's 50-50 either way. It can be both random good and random bad all at the same time.
That's actually probably a pretty good summary of this game. Random good and random bad.
That's it.
Yeah.
So we would like to say, if you have been listening to this podcast on iTunes, you are more than capable of going in and writing a review. And if you did, it would be great for us, because, one, we like to read things written about us, but also the more reviews you get, the easier it is for people that randomly just search things like retro gaming to find Retrovaniacs. And we did get yet another reader comment. Does anyone have that comment?
We do. We from Robert HHHH. Very unusual last name, but he had some kind words for us, and which we do appreciate, bringing us up to a grand total of 3 highly positive reviews.
All right.
And all 3 of us have moms, so I think we know who to thank.
That's it.
right.
But if you're not our mom, you could definitely, go to iTunes, write a review. It's free. All you got to do is tell if you like us. And if you don't like us, still give us 5 stars, but then tell us about how bad we are. But the 5 stars is the important part. So go ahead and do that. You can also find us on Twitter at Retrovaniacs. And, of course, at retrovania.net is our regular website, where you can send us emails and just generally look at videos of other games we're not going to do podcasts on, most likely. But we did get, this week, thankfully, a listener question.
That's right. We actually got a real question. I didn't actually hold somebody at gunpoint for this question. Let me reach in here in the mailbag.
The question is, who are you? Why are you in my house?
Okay, all right, here we go. Scott in Grand Rapids, Michigan asks, how do you all feel about emulated consoles like the Retron 5? I know many fans of old games refuse to even use them, saying that the original console is always the way to go. Personally, I've used a couple and they seem fine, so I'm not sure why these consoles get so much hate. Do any of you use these types of consoles, or are all of you too hipster to deal with them?
I haven't used an actual Retron 5 or a replica of anything, from NES era on. Not because I refuse to. In fact, I saw the Retron 5. I think it has every original cartridge system on it. And if that actually worked as it was intended, I think that's wonderful. I don't have to have 75 systems in my basement, much to the ire of my wife. But I still have them hooked up because I don't have a Retron 5. But I would not be opposed to trying one. What I do like that are very similar to that are the flashback units. Like they put out an Intellivision flashback this year that has replica of the original paddles. And you get some of the inlays that go on the paddles for the games. They each have 40 games, 50 games on them. I like those a lot because the original systems, while I still have my original Intellivision, it only has those old connectors with the TV cable switch, and you have to screw them into the back of the TV, and they really don't connect well to modern TVs. So the fact that I can just plug this into AV cables is wonderful. Now, it's lacking some things. I can't use every game. There's no cartridge slot, so I have to use the pre-programmed ones only. But if they made flashback units, for example, for the Nintendo that came loaded with just, say, Mario Brothers, and then you could use your regular cartridges, I would grab one at least to see if it worked well or not, because my actual Nintendo is still working, but it's very touchy.
Yeah, and I have some experience with the Retron 5. I think there are a lot of people out there that are surprisingly hostile towards such things. I really don't see the trouble. I think there's a lot of things that make it a completely viable option, whether or not you are starting to collect some of the older titles but you don't have the consoles, or my situation, if you have the consoles but getting them all out is frowned upon by your significant other. I think it's perfectly good just to have, the one box, put your Nintendo games in it, Super Nintendo Genesis, and it seems to run pretty well. It seems like every now and then, maybe on the Genesis side of things, the sound is a little, maybe a little funny, but, sound on the Genesis was usually terrible to begin with. And it seems like the Super Nintendo kind of has a little bit of slowdown here and there. I think it does perfectly fine. And another reason, probably one of the better ones, I keep an older television. It's one of the big tube televisions. Even though it's just 32 inches, it takes at least 2 people to carry this thing around, just for hooking up older consoles to, because you're talking about the Intellivision having trouble, hooking up to modern day TV. Even, some of the early Nintendo systems have trouble hooking up there. And with the Retron, you can connect your flat screen television. You don't have to go the route of keeping one of the older, very cumbersome tube televisions laying around. So I think completely bewildered as to why there's so much hostility towards it, but I think perfectly fine. Perfectly fine for playing older games.
I think everyone that I haven't had a Retron, but I had a Super Nintendo one that I found somewhere, and it was fine. I mean, it's never going to be perfect, but it's good enough. I mean, there were times where I had to really try hard to find anything wrong with the games or the emulation. And I like Billy, I don't quite understand why the purists just cannot stand using these things, because I'm probably as big of a purist as anybody, and I don't mind using them at all. They're convenient. They usually hook up through HDMI, which is great. I don't have to pull out AV cables or weird RF units. But they're fine to use to me. I absolutely do not mind using them at all.
Now, I don't have a Retron. Do they use the original controllers, or they have their own specific controller?
They have their own, but they are generally, I think with every Retron, one of the major complaints has been the controller. I can say with the 5, the controller still isn't the best kind of response-wise, but you are able to plug in the original controllers. So I really don't think, if you already have the consoles, I really don't think it's much, of an issue. You can just plug in your regular controller that you're used to using for the games.
And also, I think a big plus to using those is cost. You can go out and buy a Retron that has all of those consoles built in for, what is it, like $100 or something now? And you can't really go anywhere and find an NES or a Super NES below $50 anymore. So if you're wanting to get into collecting games, and you just don't have the money for all the systems, but you really want to start collecting games now, I think that's a really good way to go, is to just get that so you can play those games and not have to worry about saving up all this money to buy these older systems that do cost a little bit more money now.
So hopefully that answers your question. Yes, we're down with using those systems if we had them. I don't know if I'd ever say if I had my NES hooked up and I had a Retron hooked up, that I would say, I'll use the Retron instead, unless my NES was just acting badly. But I don't see a problem with it. So if you have a similar question or another question you'd like to ask us, please send it to us via our website, retrovania.net. I think we have an email there, which might just be as simple as retrovania.net, spelled out, @gmail.com. But please send us some questions. We have many more episodes coming up, including the next episode, which our random game selector has picked. Blackthorn for the Super Nintendo. Another one I have not played previously.
I think you'll like this one. If you liked Flashback or Another World, or Out of This World as it's known on the Super Nintendo, this one is very much in the same vein as Flashback. So if you like that, I think you'll like it a lot.
Yeah, I have no idea why I passed this one up. I remember seeing this in the video store. I never picked it up. I still haven't played it to this day. I'm looking forward to this one.
Well, hopefully, in 2 weeks you'll see this come up again. But if not, thank you for listening.